right. Greetings, everybody. Let's see what the sound is like. Greetings, everybody. Okay. So, I wanted to jump on tonight and discuss this paper about Booker T. Washington and African nationalism. If you haven't already, make sure go back and check my previous, the last 3 live streams that I've done. It's kind of a series where I read a paper concerning how Booker T. Washington was overlooked in terms of curriculum building in America. They put all sorts of different white guys who came after him, above him, etc., and they just blatantly ignored him. And I went through and detailed how Booker T. created a curriculum that got the students focused on learning by making the experience tied to their community and their experiences, right, their traditions. And in that, in those live streams, I mentioned that Booker T was kind of American-centric in terms of he was trying to build the black race here in America. But there's an aspect of Booker T. Washington, as discussed by Manning Marable, that it leans towards African nationalism. So I'm going to read this paper. I might have a little bit of commentary in between, but for the most part, I want you guys to just listen and tell me your thoughts about the paper in the comment section. Right? Do you think Manning Marable missed anything? Just give me your general thoughts. I appreciate it. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Make sure to like and subscribe. All the thumbs ups help. And as you share it, there's more watch time. There's more people tuning in. So make sure to share it to your pages. Don't be afraid to be black. Be unapologetically black. So this paper by Manning Marable, Booker T. Washington and African Nationalism, starts off like this. Early 20th century South African black nationalists owe much to Booker T. Washington. Washington's pro-capitalist and pro-colonialist attitudes markedly influenced his direct activities in Africa, especially in Togo. Yet far more important was Tuskegee's black nationalist and independent image to young blacks. Western educated South Africans who visited Tuskegee learned quickly the tenets of industrial education and accommodationist politics espoused by Washington. Now, we already Manning, I have an up and down relationship with him anyway. Manning already is calling Booker T an accommodationist. And if, again, go back to the live streams I recently did on Booker T being overlooked. He wasn't being an accommodationist, right? That was debunked. What he was doing was really giving black folks an education that reflected where they were and in what time and place they were, right? So they were in the South. It was just post slavery, and they had the living conditions and the life conditions of being poor in the South, right? With a Southern economy, and so he wanted them to be able to be basically masters of industry, right? And so the education was built around them being able to master the environment around them and solve any problems that was around them and make themselves saleable in that way, right? It wasn't an accommodation. That was the town to 10th type thinking. That was Du Bois and them who had that accommodationist thinking that what Washington was doing was, solidifying black folks into the lowest caste of Southern society, and that just wasn't the case. A Christianized black African, John Langalibalele Dube, so I'm just going to say John Dube, implemented Washington's self-help program in Natal, marking the beginning of a black industrial education and embryonic political demands for self-determination. Much like Marcus Garvey, young black South Africans who identified with Washington actively struggled for black capitalism and black power. Booker T. Washington, the principal of Tuskegee Novel and Industrial Institute and the most influential black American politician, believed that his philosophy of self-help and industrial education could be useful in Africa. I agree. I agree. And this goes back to the curriculum that we're trying to build. The curriculum we're trying to build is about learning how to control circumstances around you wherever you are in the African diaspora, and then being able to take that expertise back to Africa and build it. There's a saying, you've heard it in Bob Marley songs and stuff, that says, Bob Marley puts it as Africa awaits its creators. That's really a Haile Selassie statement, where His Imperial Majesty says, in a very real sense, the continent is unmade. It still awaits its creation and its creators. And that's something that we should take into high esteem, to be honest. We should take into higher esteem, right? We are Africa's creation, and we are also Africa's creators. And if we, that's something we should put on a t-shirt, right? Because, that's a good idea. Because, really, we are made African no matter where we are, and Africa needs us to take our experience and our expertise no matter where we are and go back and build her up, because she's unmade. These Eurasians have their hands in her too much. We got to go back and really change it, and it starts with education. If you want to build a nation, it starts with knowledge, right? To continue. The creator of the Atlanta Compromise, which in the words of the Atlanta Constitution's Clark Howell, was the beginning of a moral revolution in America, believed that Africans could learn from his example. The uncivilized Negro of Africa could improve himself and his society through individual initiative and the acceptance of Western religion and cosmology. Black American guidance was essential for Africans to organize and uplift themselves. Washington assisted Black Americans, Africans, and West Indians in establishing plans for the first Pan-African Conference when he visited London in 1899. Although the meeting planned such controversial issues as the cruelty of civilized paganism, the conservative Washington said that the gathering would be most effective and far-reaching. Washington begged and advised as many of our people as can possibly do so to participate in the conference. Despite their further differences, Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, the Afro-American sociologist and political leader of the 1900 London Conference, both endorsed African self-determination and education. So, and that's an important thing, right? Like, right now we have this FBA and ADOS thing going on, and they have a hatred. Real hatred. This is not hyperbole. Real hatred towards, Caribbean Africans and continental Africans, claiming that we disrespect them and all that. And the thing is about that is, because we have the leadership in those groups as clowns. Straight up clowns. The leadership, and one being worse than the other, believe it or not. The FBA is worse than the ADOS. But because, these guys like Tone Talks and stuff like that, they more see themselves closer to American slave masters and American slave master descendants than they are to, you know, Africans or those from the Caribbean. Um, and that's really a shame. Like, it's one thing you wanna waste time and push for reparations from white folks who don't give a damn about your claims for reparations. They laugh at you and you say you built this shit and this your shit. That's just, these guys are laughing at you. But if these groups were pushing real initiatives for reparations, I wouldn't have a problem with it. Just keep the xenophobia out of it, and just remember that, at the end of the day, it's still about Africa. Like Dr. John Henrik Clarke once said, he said, and most times only a half of what he said is actually repeated. But he says, the difference between a Bahamian, a Jamaican, a Black American is a stop on a ship. But the other part of what he says to that is, be proud of where you're from. But just remember that ultimately it's about Africa, right? So these two stalwarts in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s, these guys, they just didn't like one another and had differences of opinion. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and later on, Du Bois has a problem with Marcus Garvey, by the way. Right? Du Bois was one of those people pushing for Garvey to be deported. Right? But at the end of the day, they still believe that, you needed African Black self-determination and education. Right? And that's what we need today. We forget all this bickering beef, who calls who an Akata and all this, who calls who a booty. What's it again? An African booty scratch and all that stuff. It's about Africa at the end of the day. We need to be African-centered. Washington lectured on African industrial education and self-improvement and harnessed several of Tuskegee's faculty to a project of economic development in West Africa. In 1903, Washington considered visiting South Africa to establish his self-help and industrial programs among the Black population. Black and white associates of Washington believed that such an activity could be an opportunity for the most far-reaching service to mankind. In a short article several years later, Washington expounded on the possibility of Tuskegee-type schools in Africa. 9 Tuskegee students and faculty members went to Togo, German West Africa, beginning in 1900 to implement their principles' doctrines. You see, this is what you call doing the work. This is what you call doing the work. So Washington figured out how to solve problems in his community, right, via the Tuskegee School. And then he sent people out to do the same elsewhere, back on the continent. Much respect to Washington, man. The Togo experiment was only a limited success at best. Most of the students died or abandoned the project within a few years, although they did develop a small cotton crop in the region. These Afro-Americans did not go to Africa primarily to convert the pagans to Christianity, Washington wrote later. The instruction of Black people in the principles of a higher moral life involved showing the Black Africans how to raise better sheep or to create superior cotton cultivation methods, right? And again, this is what I have problems with Manning, but it's kind of this American thing that Black folks take on, that they're better than other Black folks, and that's just a fact, right? You listen to the FBA types, and it's all about them being exceptional and this, that, and the other, but yet cops are killing your people here with almost impunity. Why aren't you stopping it? Since you are the shit, why aren't you stopping it? Right? And so it's just ridiculous. But the reality of it is, if you come from a country that is further along in terms of its technology, and it's science. Then when you go to a country that's behind, of course you're ahead of them. And it's your duty as an African to teach other Africans who are behind and help pull them up. That's our duty. Our duty as Africans is to pull everyone up to the same level, right? So at least, I mean, they say that the project failed within a few years or whatever, but at least they executed the idea. And again, this is like early 1900s. They executed an idea, and you know, even with failure, there's something positive out of failure, because now you have something to examine. You have an idea where and how to improve, right? The next time you try to do it. There are differences between Africans and Afro-Americans, however. The natives have never been educated by contact with the white man in the same way that American blacks and Washington himself had been. They have never been educated in day school, not in industrial school or college, Washington lamented. Hence, their ambitions have never been awakened. Right? Unlike African Methodist Episcopal Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, Washington argued that a return to Africa for the Negro is out of the question. And by the way, John Henry Clark said this too, but Bishop Henry McNeil Turner is a forgotten Pan-Africanist. People really don't discuss him the way they should. I think I'm going to do an episode on him soon. I'm going to do an episode on him soon, because he's a forgotten guy. Okay? Anyway, Washington argued that a return to Africa for the Negro is out of the question. Again, Washington was U.S.-centered. Still, Washington was convinced that conditions for blacks throughout Africa would markedly improve if there were more African educational institutions based on the Tuskegee ideal. But Washington, egotistical and markedly conservative in outlook, did not personally invest any major portion of his time or capital in assisting Black Africa. He explained to a Zulu student in Berlin, Prince Thomas Makaru, that it would be a source of much pleasure to me if he could improve the condition of your people in Africa, yet he could not abandon his school. Tuskegee's commercial schemes in Togo worked exclusively with German colonial interests, rather than with independent Black Africans, and that's not good. Right? When Benito Sylvain, aide-de-camp to Emperor Menelik, wrote to Tuskegee offering to teach Black history, Washington curtly informed him that the school year was over. Washington declined an offer from Dr. James L. Barton, Secretary of the Foreign Department of the American Board of Commissions for Foreign Missions, to speak at a Zulu ceremony in Durban, Natal, South Africa. Washington's International Conference on the Negro in April 1912 was oriented towards missionary and white colonial guidelines. Tuskegee's self-help programs run by white liberals could be a very proper modern African education. Yeah, I don't know about that. It would be a mistake to consider Washington's influence on the modern African mind by simply reviewing his direct associations with colonial administrators or his friendship with capitalist enterprises. An astounding amount of the correspondence of Washington, his secretary Emmett Scott, and his advisor, socialist Professor Robert Park, with Black nationalists implies Tuskegee's guarded support for Black militant endeavors. West African leader Casey Hayford, Black nationalist and editor of the Gold Coast Leader, had read Up From Slavery and wrote Washington in 1904 that his concepts might help to produce the solution of the race problem. Washington replied encouragingly that he desired young Hayford to visit his institution. Dusset Muhammad, editor of the Militant African Times and Orient Review of London, an early associate of Marcus Garvey, received Washington's assistance in obtaining articles on Tuskegee's purpose and on the 1912 racial conference. Washington warned Muhammad that if the paper you speak of should be formed for the mere purpose of voicing a vague unrest, it would not succeed. However, criticism of whites was necessary and valuable occasionally, and he hoped that Muhammad's new and important enterprise would have every success. Yeah, so, Washington had an interesting kind of outlook on how to deal with white folks. I think on one hand, he worked with them with a grin, and on the other hand, he kind of kept them at arm's length. But he still he still is American-centered. And with being American-centered, that means you are next to whiteness, right? South African black leaders experiencing a form of institutional racism similar to that in the American South naturally looked to Tuskegee for advice and support. A. Kirkland Soga, editor of Izwi Labantu, Voice of the Bantu, wrote to Washington in 1903 regarding an introduction of the Tuskegee industrial system in South Africa. Washington sent Soga his photo and information about Tuskegee to publish in his newspaper. Saul J. Plage, the first Secretary General of the South African Native National Congress, ANC, wrote to Washington in 1913 for assistance in operating a linotype machine. Plage observed that Washington was a champion of the cause of the dark and backward races. A thankful job. African students who traveled to Tuskegee in the 1890s and 1900s found an institution that could prove to be essential to nationalist prerogatives and independent advancement. Pixley Ka Issaka Semi, brilliant black student at Columbia and Oxford universities, and the leading political organizer of the ANC, corresponded with Washington over a period of years. I visited Tuskegee last summer, Semi wrote to Washington in January 1904, and was carried away with your plan. We need your spirit in South Africa. Washington was pleased to learn from Semi that he had organized an African student union at Oxford the next year. More and more I am learning, Washington confided in Semi, that you face in South Africa in a somewhat different and more difficult form the same task we have in this country. Washington seemed pleased as Semi wrote that Africa is certainly awakening, mighty, and hopeful. This is over 100 years ago, people. John Dube, Zulu educator and first president of the ANC, first visited Tuskegee in May 1897. He informed Washington by mail that I am very much interested in just the same work that you are for my people, the Zulus of South Africa. During the formal commencement exercises in late May, Washington introduced a young African to the audience and called on him to say a few words. Dube responded gladly with an elaborate address that praised Washington's industrial education work and detailed the urgent need for self-help programs among his people of South Africa. Impressed newspaper correspondents called Dube's speech an address of rare force, greatly appreciated by everyone. In fact, the Zulu came near being the hero of commencement. Dube gave a lecture on home life in Zululand in town on May 28th, discussing aspects of the Zulu life and mind and Cecil Rhodes of the Boers. 1 month later, at Hampton Institute, Tuskegee's sister institution, Dube told a graduation audience about his Zulu heritage and his pressing desire to appeal to you tonight for Africa, that dark continent. His American experience had taught him that the greatest need of my people is industrial education. greatest need of my people is industrial education. We really are lacking in this understanding. Um, I've talked about it ad nauseum already in the previous 3 live streams, but we really need to understand how important scientific and industrial education is. Basically, STEM education is. You want to build up a nation, you gotta tie STEM activities with your economics. That's just what it is. And these guys understood this again over 100 years ago. We got to do better. We got to do better to get the knowledge that it takes to build a nation. Dubé's complete adherence to Booker Washington's philosophy was remarkable. Dubé glorified Washington, the son of a slave, in an August 1904 article entitled "Are Negroes Better Off in Africa?" Conditions and opportunities of Negroes in America and Africa compared. Look that up. In the Missionary Review of the World. This same kind of educational training is needed for the African Christians, Dubé argued. Times and conditions require it. The educated black man could accept the self-help doctrine. The South African black man was eager to learn, and his natural independence made him super material to take on an energetic Christian civilization. You could tell the problem I have going on here, but we'll talk about that later. Like Washington, Dubé believed that a pragmatic alliance with white paternalists in South Africa was essential for black economic participation in society. You see, again, these folks were thinking about raising up the people and being amongst white people in an African country, like sharing rule in an African country with white folks, right, with the Boers. And that's just so short-sighted, right? But again, you see, this is the thing too. Your heroes of old might do some things that we today would scratch our heads over. Does that mean that your heroes should be thrown away or should be denigrated, right? Like, we got to understand these folks were sometimes in these situations, and their experiences, their upbringing, their life experience played heavily into some of their decisions. Think of MLK, for example, right? Father was a pastor, so he came up as a pastor himself, and he had the same kind of pastor thinking that most black pastors probably had at the time, right? Look at Bishop Talbot Swan nowadays, right? As much as he speaks up for the black condition and what's going on to blacks in America, he's still a pastor. He's still tied to a religion that played a heavy role in our subjugation, right? So, when you read this, it might really upset you at some points, but understand their proximity to the problem and how they came up, right, in that problem, okay? Dubé observed that although the lot of the natives under the Boer seemed to be one of slavery, robbery, and injustice, conditions would improve soon because the British sense of justice existed throughout South Africa, which is just foolishness. Dubé warned his white allies sternly that even without their full assistance, the attempts to keep the black man down will not win ultimately. I mean, the idea of allies, white allies, is just crazy. But, okay. Jefferson D.T. Jabovu, black politician and the father figure of African education, was profoundly influenced by Tuskegee. After he graduated from the University of London, the South African Minister of Native Affairs commissioned him to make an active study of the methods being used at Tuskegee, with a view of adopting them in connection with the education of the natives of South Africa. In the summer and autumn 1913, Jabovu examined the school's facilities and talked with members of the faculty and students. Jabovu gave several recitals featuring violin solos and songs on campus on the eve of returning to England and South Africa, and spoke of Washington's educational program in glowing terms. Within several years, with government assistance, Jabovu helped to establish a South African Native College at Fort Hara, based in part on Tuskegee's curriculum. Washington marked anti-labor and unavowedly capitalist platform also found support among his African followers. Washington firmly believed that when a black man is the largest taxpayer in a community, his neighbors will not object long to his voting. He attacked socialism, trade unionism, and leftist politics as detrimental to the fortunes of the black race and to the fortunes of his Christ-like philanthropists. Like Washington, John Dewey believed that educated blacks should not protest to alter society, but to struggle to become part of a competitive culture. You know, I kind of agree with that. Again, what you see going on now and what has been going on since the Civil Rights Movement. Like, instead of arguing to be seen the same and to be allowed into other people's drinking holes and eating places and all this old shit, like, to me, it makes more sense to educate your group, your community, your culture, and give that culture the directive to be competitive. I think being competitive is way more important than being included. You feel me? So, like, you know, and I can hear the groans coming right out as soon as I say this, but like, a lot of black folks are anti-capitalist. I remember I told a sister this about a year or two ago, and since that time, that sister hasn't really spoken to me since, and that's fine. But regardless to how you feel about capitalism, the reality is you're in a capitalist society. And I understand, because I kind of look at there being, you know, like, in a sense, two capitalisms, right? There's the capitalism that used our black bodies of our ancestors to build wealth, right? And, you know, there's some of that still going on today, you know, and it's imperialist, right? But the idea of capitalizing, let's move away from what these Europeans have done. What the Europeans have done with capitalism is like what your Bible will call throwing pearls to swine. There's nothing wrong with venturing and capitalizing off your venture. The problem it becomes when you put profits over people. And then the real problem, even on top of that, is when, and you know, and this is where cronyism and stuff comes in, is when you choose, or not you choose, but when the others choose who can be successful and who can't be successful. That's a problem. But regardless to what you might think of that system, that's the system you're in. And the best thing you could do in that system is to be competitive. That's the best thing we can do, is be competitive. I'm not saying that we must go and put profits over people and all that stuff. No, I would never say that. but we gotta compete. And in fact, as I've stated before, and I've seen others on social media saying something similar, we gotta compete at least enough to have the resources to go back and build Africa. Africa awaits its creators. We can't stay here. Ultimately, here is not for our people. But here is a good place to get your shit together, get your affairs in order, get some resources, and head on back with your expertise to help create Africa. I continue. If a white laborer was afraid of native competition, Dubé wrote in 1901, he is not worthy of the race to which he belongs. At a missionary conference in Durban in July 1920, Jabavu warned whites that Africans attracted to Bolshevism and revolution should be directed to a needed antidote, the Young Men's Christian Association. Good God, man. Seme, Dubé, Platje, and other ANC members were not, as Soviet historian Potekin wrote, anti-progressive or representatives of a feudal philosophy. Rather, paralleling Washington's accommodationist philosophy and black capitalist concepts in America, the ANC leaders appealed to white benevolence and thus could not afford to support anti-business and anti-government forces. They appeal to white benevolence. Okay. You guys know what I want to say there, right? KW Don 7, thanks for tuning in. Peace, family. Yes, you're right. European capitalism is feudalism. And it's problematic, right? Again, that's why I say, you throw in pearls to swine. These Europeans are swine, right? But there's a way to maneuver in this society where you're not, as black folks, we're not as problematic as they are. And that's why I push the idea personally that we need to compete, right? It's like we're playing basketball, right? With a black team, we're playing against the white team, and the white team is busting our ass in basketball. Do we stop playing basketball and play soccer? Or do we, get better? Let's say they're busting us in the first half. Do we play better in the second? Like, you gotta compete. And the thing about competing is, like, if you learn to compete here, to sound like Frank Sinatra, you could compete anywhere, right? You take that competitive spirit. Africa is 100 times, 1,000 times better for it, right? So, where was I? The institution most representative to Tuskegee influence in South Africa was Dubé's Zulu Christian Industrial School, founded in August 1901 outside Durban. Students desiring to enroll in the School of labored in the Institute's 30 acres of groundnuts, corn, potatoes, beans, bananas, oranges, and peaches. Others obtain employment at a laboring job to earn £2.50, £12.50, to attend classes every 4.5 months term. Students paid their teachers' salaries out of any funds they raised, and Dubé's salary came from his service as pastor of a nearby American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions Church. Mrs. Dubé organized a women's prayer meeting every Wednesday afternoon, along with her regular sewing and choir classes. Students learn arithmetic and English, and all persons at the Institute give a certain amount of labor for the physical maintenance of the school. As in Booker Washington's Institute, so here, Dubé observed, no money is expended for outside labor which the pupils can be made to do for themselves. Dubé's school sought to give black Africans a chance to compete for lower white collar and blue collar jobs in the new society, such self sufficiency and independence were basic tenets of emergent black capitalist power. Hmm. What do y'all think about that line right there? Dubé's school sought to give black Africans a chance to compete for lower white collar and blue collar jobs in the new society. Self sufficiency and independence were basic tenets of emerging black capitalist power. KW Don 7 says Amos Wilson taught that there's no such thing as a free market system. I tend to agree, actually. I agree. Let me just find this thing right quick. Let me see if I can find this. See if I can find this thing. I can't find it right now. But anyway, let me continue. Dubé's accomplishments pleased Booker Washington. It's weird that they say Booker Washington, Booker T. Washington, and the mentor retained clippings of his disciples' exploits. Several Brooklyn, New York congressionalists, members of Dubé's American Committee of Supporters, informed Washington about Dubé's industrial education activities and the establishment of a Zulu language newspaper. Several times in 1907, Washington wrote to Dubé requesting any materials that illustrated that any great number of the natives have come to appreciate the value of education and are making sacrifices to secure it. Washington realized that Dubé had some insight as to the direction which deeper currents of thought and feeling are taking in the native mind. Louis Stoiber, American friend of Dubé and Semi, observed to Washington that Dubé's great activities in Natal were a child of your work very much, as little strawberry plants and little pineapple plants spring from the parent strawberry and pineapple respectively. One element of Washington's philosophy that black Africans were undoubtedly attracted to was his racial pride and black nationalist tendencies. And this is really why I wanted to read this, right? Check in with chat room for a second. Oh yeah, KW Don. I know exactly who you are. I'm aware. I'm aware. I didn't know your full name, but I'm aware that you follow me. I know you just responded to a post I put up on Instagram like a day or so ago. Yeah, I know who you are. Well, thanks for tuning in, man. I appreciate it. Any comments on the reading so far? What's your opinion of the reading so far? As you answer that, I'll go back to the paper and do some more reading again. So I was one element of Washington's philosophy that black Africans were undoubtedly attracted to was his racial pride and black nationalist tendencies. Prior to his Atlanta Compromise, Washington stated that conventions designed to discuss racism were proper. In 1894, he encouraged black people to boycott Jim Crow streetcars. Washington expressed his esteem for blackness at a lecture in New York in September 1904. Our people need to be taught pride of race. I have no hesitation. Washington declared in asserting that I am as proud of my race as you whites are of yours. He stated that as his mode of education increased, racial pride will increase. And I believe in that too. In spite of his, because you see, when you solve a problem, don't you feel good about yourself? So when these students are receiving this education that deals with their experiences, their community, and problem solving in their community, don't you think they're gonna feel good, so to speak, about themselves and about the others that are that look like them and come from the same community as them, and the same continent ultimately as them? That's racial pride, right? In spite of his accommodationist rhetoric, Washington actively sought to build black economic power and racial pride in the United States. So a part of Washington's thing, I kind of touched on it earlier, is that Washington knew damn well in the South he could be lynched. I think he played ball, right? To use a sports analogy again. I think he played ball, right? I think he knew, he had to play. He had to play the game to get by without being lynched, right? But deep down, he actively sought to build black economic power and racial pride in the United States. Now, he was Christian, so that's why I would have some ideological differences with it. But I get it. Washington, let me check in with. Okay, no comment. Washington's nationalism and racial pride were early influences on Marcus Garvey. The founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, best known black militant in the 20th century. Garvey first obtained his desire to be a race leader when he read Up from Slavery. And that's something you all should read too, by the way. I think I have got the PDF version. If I have in the PDF version, I'll upload it to Discord. And you guys ask me how to get to it, and I'll show you the way. You can join my Discord. If I don't have it in a PDF, I have it in an audio book too. After working as a publicist in the West Indies and London, Garvey wrote to Washington that he hoped to establish a Tuskegee-type school in Jamaica. Garvey's economic platform of black capitalism, his hostility to Du Bois, and his brand of Negro nationalism greatly mimic Washington. Similarly, black Africans were also influenced. Black scholar Edward W. Blyden viewed Washington's activity as a symbol of black economic independence, proof of what the African can do for himself. Early in his career, such black nationalist tendencies marked John Dewey's rhetoric. At his address at Hampton in 1897, he declared sincerely that Africa was the Negro's God-given country. 1897. And you are trying to shun Africa in 2020. Washington's ideology was also evident in the activities of the Reverend Joseph Booth and John Chilembwe, both of Southern Africa. Booth, formerly a Baptist missionary in Nyasaland and Northern Rhodesia, corresponded with Washington over a 20-year period. Damn. Must have taken like 5 years for a letter just to reach one direction, right? In 1896, Booth proposed to Washington industrial mission stations in South Africa worked by competent native Christians or others of the African race, based on a Tuskegee-type self-supporting basis. Booth demanded an Africa for the African. Washington Scott and Robert Park met with Booth on his visits to the United States and were rather friendly toward his efforts, at least until 1913. Booth's black companion, Chilembwe, was a student in the United States from 1897 until 1900, and at one point lectured with John Dewey in Brooklyn, New York. In Brooklyn, New York, churches raising money for their respective programs. Both young men gave talks on Southern Africa pleaded with their audience for funds for their proposed self-help schools. And Mrs. Dubé, a good singer, entertained audiences addressed by her husband. In 1915, Chilembwe organized and led the famous Bloody Rebellion. I don't know why that happens. The stream cuts off sometimes. Yeah, the stream cuts off, and it's all good because I am recording it. And I'm recording it. Let me see what Kevin said. I read Up from Slavery, and the impression I got from Booker T. Washington was that he had the same anti-African sentiment that Frederick Douglass had, but this reading is changing my mind a little bit. Yeah, I think, again, Booker T being kind of U.S. centered, I think, even in the beginning of this reading, you know, the way Booker T and stuff really talked about the African, talked about them in a kind of a lowly type of way, right? But I think ultimately, Booker did believe in the African working towards self-determination, right? And looks like I might have been cut off, which is crazy. And so we gotta keep that in mind. Let me finish reading this because the live stream seemed like it stopped. I'll just upload the full thing. Thankfully, I recorded it. So Mrs. Dubé, a good singer, entertained audiences addressed by her husband. In 1915, Chilembwe organized and led the famous Bloody Rebellion against the white British authorities in the Nyasaland frontier. Chilembwe vividly illustrates the basic elements of militant Garveyism within Washington's philosophy. That'll be something to talk about in the future too. Yeah, that'll be a good idea. South Africa's unification with its co-committing loss of black civil rights prompted African leaders to seek newer ways of joining the mainstream of emerging capitalist society. The abortive Bambatha Rebellion and racial disturbances in Natal, 1906 to 1908, convinced South African whites to increase civil restrictions on even educated Bantus. Reacting to white antagonism, Dubé helped to convene a meeting of representatives of all major South African black communities at Bloemfontein on March 24, 1909. They issued protests against the proposed color bar in Parliament, demanded social respect and rights for blacks, Indians, and colors, and agreed to finance the excursion of several representatives from their meeting to Britain for further protests. Semi, then a Johannesburg lawyer, became convinced that black political coalitions could be the only effective means to abate white encroachments upon the remaining civil rights that black Africans had. He, Sol Plaatje, and other moderate black leaders organized the ANC in 1912, naming John L. Dubé its first president. Dubé informed Washington through Stoiber that he was hesitant to become a political militant. I regarded a duty to my people to keep in check the red-hot republicanism of more radical blacks, Dubé wrote. However, Dubé and Plaatje were among ANC members who joined in a deputation to England to protest the Natives Land Act of 1913. Subsequent ANC leaders rejected the accommodationism of its founders, but the leadership elite had only followed many of the successful doctrines of another accommodator, Booker T. Washington. Dubé's private goals were not only to establish a Tuskegee in Africa, but to ultimately attain civil rights in a racist society. Dubé wrote to Harriet E. Colenso in 1917 that black Africans are aware that they cannot expect justice and fair play under the present government. What does that sound like right now? I mean, doesn't that sound like some of us talking right now? You can't expect justice and fair play under the present government in the current land that you're in? Yet during the 1930s, Dubé organized the Bantu Business League in Natal, mimicking Washington's own National Negro Business League and its formula to push Negroes into the mainstream of America's political economy. The ANC president, Josiah Gumede, declared that Soviet Russia was the only real friend of all subjected races. God damn it. Dubé and his associates united to oust him from his position in 1930. Let me look up this guy. To oust him from his position in 1930. Pixley Seme succeeded Gumede, pledging to maintain only limited political protests against the white regime. Gumede, a former editor of Le Linge Las Natal, angrily reacted against the ANC's accommodation by creating the League of African Rights, the first coalition of workers, blacks, and communists. These leaders ousted Gumede and ANC radicals because their leftist attitudes contradicted their own pro-capitalist economic and political views. It is no accident that these early ANC elite leaders so vehemently denounced socialism and so vigorously defended black private enterprise. No accident that these early ANC leaders so vehemently denounced socialism and so vigorously defended black private enterprise. To be sure, let me see if this thing connected or anything. Nope, didn't connect. It's all good. To be sure, individual circumstances rather than pure ideology dictated the black responses to colonialism in Africa and to white racism in the American South. But Washington's educational, political, and economic attitudes were crucial in the South African protest experience. It was partially through the vivid image of Tuskegee as a symbol of black opportunity in a business-oriented economy that influenced ANC leaders struggled for black education and equal rights. They and other African nationalists believed, like Kenya's Harry Thuku, that Tuskegee was an island of black defiance in the traditions of the white South. These men did not completely understand their societies. Moderate protests for biracial opportunity could not abolish racism when the white bourgeoisie society would only seriously consider revolutionary demands. These men did not completely understand their societies. Moderate protests for biracial opportunity could not abolish racism, I agree, when the white bourgeoisie society would only seriously consider revolutionary demand. You'll pass this on to some of your ADO SFBA friends. Yet despite the failures to change society, Washington's philosophy in both continents helped to create a nationalistic, proud, and dynamic elite of black people. That's the end of that paper. So I know that the live stream shut off. Thankfully, I had the sense and I've learned how to record my live streams on my computer. You know what I want you guys to do? Tell me your thoughts on this paper. What are your thoughts on the Christian aspect of all of this? What are your thoughts on Booker T. Washington and and what you think his outlook on the African was? You know, we had Kevin Donaldson in the chat, and he was talking about how he read Up From Slavery, which I have too, and his impression he got from Booker T was that he had the same anti-African sentiment that Frederick Douglass had. You know, what are your thoughts on Booker T now? After hearing this paper read to you, written by Manning Marable, what are your thoughts on Booker T now? And then when you take into consideration what I read to you concerning Booker T's philosophy on curriculum building, what is your take on Booker T? What I hope you will see is how important this idea of education, this particular style of education, right, following this curriculum, this experimental curriculum that Booker T really made happen at Tuskegee, and to see that the continent paid attention to what Booker T did in America. So, you know, that also says something about this notion that it wasn't until civil rights that black folks got foreign blacks here. That's not true. But I want you to take that into thought, and hopefully you will realize how important this initiative that the Bitter Medicine podcast is trying to push. Right? We need to go back and look at what Booker T was doing and update it for the now and for the future. And we gotta do it, and we gotta get more grounded as being Africans. This stuff that you see going on out here with people trying to deny their Africanness, people trying everything to be Native American now, people trying to be, you know, the folks that was here already and tied into the folks brought on ships. Whatever, man. At the end of the day, even if you were here before the ships came, you came from the continent. Right? And so we need to get back to continent thinking, continent mindedness. Right? We've got to get back to that. And again, make sure to like, give me a thumbs up, make sure to share. Let's get other people talking about it. Let's get other people listening to these ideas. And make sure that you and everyone around you subscribe. It's very important that we start to get these numbers up for the podcast as we start to build towards this plan that we have. Okay? So I'm going to end it there. Next time you hear from me, I'll be reading some other paper. I was reading a paper recently on brain drain from Africa. I might discuss that, or I might discuss one of the writings in this paper or people in this paper that I said I was going to ultimately discuss again in the future. Yeah, so until next time, this has been the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Peace.